if there's any theme coming out here it's that the memory story is so foundational to no matter what aspect you're in neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. We have to get a grip on it one way or the other. Again, just because people wrote it 800 years ago doesn't mean it was idiotic. It was people who thought very carefully about thinking. Science has become replaced by engineering, or basically, at least in my area, in cognitive neuroscience, science is now correlation and regression, and that's engineering.
This is Brain Inspired. Hey everyone, I am Paul. My guest today is becoming a recurring character on this podcast. David Poeppel has appointments all over the place, but he runs his lab at NYU, where they study auditory cognition, speech perception, language, and music. So says his lab website. So like I said, David's been on the podcast multiple times in the past, once by himself, once with Yuri Buzaki. And the reason why he's on today is because a few episodes ago, on episode 172, I had David Glanzman on the podcast. And David Glanzman came on to discuss his work, trying to show that memory is stored not between neurons at the synapse, which is the established story or dogma, but rather that memory is stored within neurons, likely in a more stable form in the nucleus of the neuron. So a week or so after that episode, David Poeppel popped into my email appreciating David Glanzman's work and reiterating how important it is for neuroscience to figure out something so fundamental, how memory works in the brain. So we discussed that and surrounding topics. We discuss similar things for language, which is one of David's focuses. And we end by talking about David and Nina Kazanina's recent reexamination of the idea of what's called the language of thought. So the language of thought is a poorly named construct because it doesn't necessarily have to do with language. Actually, it doesn't really have to do with language at all. But it's the idea that our thoughts must be governed by some orderly, logical structure and rules. And David and Nina show how, in principle, neuroscience already has some of the data suggesting that a language of thought is possible and should be studied at the neural level. And besides that, we just talk about how David thinks about brains and how he thinks that brains and minds should be studied, which we've talked about a little bit before, but we go over again and in more detail. And I think it's important to have people like David in the field to remind us that it's important to think critically and think deeply about these topics. Okay, show notes are at braininspired.co/podcast/176. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters. You guys make my world go round. All right, and here is David Poeppel. The reason we're talking today, welcome back. Good to see you, by the way.
Thank you. Good to see you. I'm glad to have a chance to chat and see if we can cause more confusion or make more problems for someone else.
Well, this is kind of an impromptu discussion because I recently had David Glanzman on and talking about memories as being stored within the nucleus internally, memory as a molecular process. And this prompted you to reach out. And I had forgotten, actually, because I think of you as the language and rhythms and the linking hypotheses kind of guy. But I had forgotten when I did my little 100th episode series, and I think it was in answer to the question, what is holding us back? I was surprised that you had mentioned our concept of memory, our understanding of, or lack thereof, of memories. And so then I was reminded of that when you emailed David and I about that episode. So I really have no agenda, like I told you before, but I wanted to get your thoughts on, that aspect. But then you've written about memory recently too, so we'll talk about that and a host of other topics as well.
So why don't we just? So I was sitting in the car, driving from I think Cape Cod back to New York, and I was listening to a couple of your podcasts, and then I had not listened to David Glanzman's episode, and I have never met David, but I knew that one of my former research assistants Emma Laurent, who's actually Gilles Laurent's daughter, and herself now a graduate student in psychology. She had worked in his lab, and the name sort of crept up. And I said, I really must listen to this. And I was absolutely fascinated. I thought it was a really great discussion. People should listen to that episode. Also, because of the really cool historical examples and perspective that Glanzman gives in the discussion with you. And of course, yeah, it stimulated me because I've been thinking about that stuff from a slightly different perspective. But he is much closer to the kind of perspective that Randy Gallistel has also articulated. And these people have spent a long time thinking about the kind of conceptual challenges of memory. And I was like, all right, this is not silly. This is the when you hear this kind of challenge for the first time, your
Yeah.
sort of knee-jerk reaction might be, yeah, a bunch of old cranks. Their feelings are hurt that some papers from the 60s weren't carefully read or something like that. But then you get into it and you're like, well, actually, they have some really deep, challenging points to our conception of memory and storage in particular. And so I was very moved by that. And in fact, I had organized last year in Germany a little workshop called Beyond Associations, which was organized a little bit about Randy Gallistel's thinking. So this topic is not dormant anymore. I think an increasing number of us in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience are aware that there's a serious problem.
Well, I mean,
And
David,
that it's going to possibly hold us back. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you said it's not being ignored, but in my conversation with David, his woes in obtaining funding and the arc of his research lab, the size of it has dwindled, et cetera. One might take home the opposite conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's because he was on this early on, as I guess was Gallistel. Maybe they've been thinking and writing about this for 10 years, and that's been tricky. But now, I think in the last couple of years, their message is being received more, I wouldn't say enthusiastically. On the contrary, I talk to my colleagues and friends. They think it's outrageous and stupid, and we have well-developed synaptic theories, and get out of here. But I think it's just I think a growing number of us coming from different fields. As I also then wrote to David Glanzman in response to the episode with you, we're thinking about similar problems because we don't have a good story, right? So Glanzman in his discussion with you mentioned all these wonderful and really quirky historical experiments on planaria, and chopping up this, that, and the other thing, and the problem of what does it mean to have nuclear storage. And likewise, when you talk to someone like Randy Gallistel, he brings computational challenges like how would you in fact have something like stuff that you can put together if you have only synaptic mechanisms. Very difficult. I mean, just fundamental problems like compositionality. And so why does this relate to what we do at all? And because we have a very concrete question about storage, which is you have a vocabulary. This is not a complicated idea to get across. Like, we're having this conversation. We have a bag of words in our head, and it works pretty well. And we have pretty decent estimates across languages what that means. And so you have to have a story for that. You can't just blow that off. That's one of the core things of how we, communicate, think, deal with ourselves. So that problem is and the reason I reached out to David Glanzman is not to say, oh, we're very close to have an idea about how, the storage of your mental lexicon works. Absolutely not. On the contrary, we don't know our ass from our elbow. But
that's a good alternate title. You sent me this piece that you wrote, a short piece in Trends in Cognitive Science, and the title of that says it all. It's we don't know how the brain stores anything, let alone words. But I like your recent phrasing there as well.
Yes, I mean, there's a more muscular phrasing. And so what I wanted to so the point I wanted to make is or share is that not that we have any kind of systematic, sensible understanding of how stuff is stored in the language domain. No, not at all. It's that we have pretty good theories, cognitive, linguistic, computational theories of what has to be accomplished. That is to say, we can kind of decompose the problem in some sensible way and say, like, look, if you can't do A, B, C, D, you're toast. And so let's just take, some facet of the memory stuff that you have to accomplish somehow. And so maybe that allows us a kind of way in to have more, mechanistic implementational approaches to the problem. So the computational theory, to be Marian about it, is pretty well worked out. And we have alternative implementation levels of analysis. And well, algorithmically, we are kind of stuck. But that's where I think there's a connection between people like David Glanzman's concern. And he has a very nice paper that where he kind of goes through the history and the arguments and why there is actually not so much of a tension, or there's a possibility to resolve the tension between the synaptic mechanisms. It's not like they're not there. But then the challenges of long-term storage, which may or may not be intracellular mechanisms. So I think there's a game in town, and the fact that it's unpopular probably means that there's a there.
Well, I think, I don't know how you feel about this, but one of the things I'm recurringly struck with is I don't know if in neuroscience, with the modern computationalism approach, everything is computation, if we've lost sight of the fact that the super impressive fact that all of these things are nested across levels, right? Whether you're talking, of course, the synapse, for things to happen at the synapse, you have to have intracellular quote unquote machinery, biological processes, right? So there is something happening in the cell, but do we need to? Is that the nexus of memory? Do we need to locate memories inside the cell? And how these things interact, I think, is one of the, to me, just recurring impressive feats of, if you could call it that, of biology. And I don't know if modern neuroscience is missing that or not appreciating it enough. And I don't know your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, it's super impressive. And I think that the attempt to at least sort of productively speculate or hypothesize about what is the relation between all this rich intracellular stuff and what happens to the outside. How do you is totally open, and it's impressive that it works at all.
Right.
So suppose somebody like Glanzman or Gallistel or others that are Hessam Aglakpour, who has this extremely interesting theory based of RNA based computation, super interesting. So if these guys, suppose one of these guys are right, and let's say you store some item, for in the case of Gallistel, he's really about number. Right? He thinks a lot about numeric cognition, and in particular inserting values, variables into equations and stuff like that for navigation. Or suppose you're me and you want to store a word,
or syllable,
cat, cat video or cat syllable. Then how do you actually how do you then externalize it to the surface so they can, so that information, suppose it is it's a series of ones and zeros, at the most abstract level. How do you actually then convey that so they can say two cats? Right. So is that actually all done in the cell, or is that so we still have synaptic mechanisms. We have communication between cells that's probably underestimated in its complexity. But you have to then get it out. You have to get the information in, and you have to get the information out. David Glanzman has some interesting ideas about this, and I think it's important about the short terminess of synaptic mechanisms, and let's say a sort of evaluative mechanism. Maybe that's a good way. You don't want to write everything into cells or something like that. But anyway, there's a kind of rich series of problems where we're just, we go to, we open our textbook, whatever, Candel, Bayer, any of these things, Nichols, and we say, oh, look at this theory of the synapse, so cool, it's glutamate, wow, awesome. And then you're like, well, but wait a minute. Now let's actually think of what you have to do. And so I think the fact that it works is amazing, but the fact that we don't even have the intellectual courage to say we're missing something really profound in our understanding, that's kind of lame. I mean, that has to change. And it's your job to make it change by pushing having
Right.
people
Yeah.
keep talking about it.
Okay, good.
That's on you. If it doesn't
Okay,
work.
good. So small responsibility. But so, a lot of the experiments that Glanzman has done and talks about, and, you kill an aplesia, you extract its RNA. You don't have to kill it. You extract its RNA. I guess you do kill it. Anyway, you extract its RNA, you put it in a new one, and that new one all of a sudden has a quote unquote learned behavior, or some sort of behavior is transferred. Some people say, well, okay, that's awesome, but that's, really low level. It's like a procedural memory. It's just behavior. And then, so for instance, in reaction to this episode with David Glanzman, someone wrote in our little Discord community, they said, I know it's almost cliche to ask, quote, but what even are memories, end quote, at this point, because I feel like we run into that question with almost every guest. And, he goes on to articulate just some confusion about, well, how, he has trouble thinking about storage at the intracellular level, at the synapse. How do we even approach thinking about this? But anyway, so back to the kinds of experiments that have been done, and what I want to get to is ask you, how do you feel about what's your bet about whether this is a feasible thing with higher level cognitive stuff like words, concepts, etc. Because what we've seen so far is, it's sophisticated, monarch butterfly, flying patterns, etc. A caterpillar's brain gets, I think I have this right, gets totally disintegrated and reformed, and it has the memory of what it was taught, etc. But you could say these are kind of low level cognitive feats, perhaps.
Yeah. Why would it be different in kind? It's information of some form that needs to be stored, it needs to be written down, needs to be written out, right? Stored and retrieved to be used for subsequent steps, operations, computations, whatever metaphor you prefer. And so I don't see why it would be different in kind. It would be a tremendous feat and super informative if we knew anything like that about the caterpillar to moth transformation or how a word is stored. And that all I want to, look, my non-contribution, but just sort of stimulation. Why not? So why, again, back to the word stuff, because it's uncontroversial that we store such things and that we have them in long-term memory and that they're in some sense abstract or complicated or, whatever. No, it's just, why would actually navigation be any less abstract, by the way? But that's for later. So we know certain things about this. So for example, here's what we know. You make contact with whatever that stored thing is through sight, through sound, through touch. Right? So you can actually, so you have pointers so that already tells you something about the format. The format must be sufficiently flexible or abstract that different sensory modalities, in fact, any sensory modality, can actually reach that stored thing. So that's already pretty interesting. It needs to be in a kind of format that you can actually take another thing and stick them together, make a chain, make a different kind of representation. It needs to be connected to something that generates output, so a motor coordinate system. So we have certain criteria or kind of desiderata, to be more hoity-toity, that simply must be met on a logical ground. And I think, step by step, peeling away the layers are just kind of interesting computational clues on what has to be accomplished. And if it turns out that one of those little clues is solved in in planaria or in the caterpillar to moth transition, that's fine. We're looking for mechanistic hints of how that could even be accomplished. And so my complaint about the literature is, and I'm actually working on a paper with this one of my graduate students, is we have been seduced by focusing on the implementation level of description when we talk about these problems, because we have cool experiments working on synaptic stuff, because they're doable, they're cool, they're by and large replicable if you do them, well, and so on and so forth. And we're building an edifice of descriptive stuff that we have kind of been much more cavalier. And this is, I think, where Randy Galsto is so important about saying, well, what has to be accomplished here? What are actually what is memory for? What does it mean to carry information forward? I mean, that is the most core sense what memory is, right? So it's you have information that's stored and carried forward and can be used.
Well, that's storage. Is that memory? But how, what should we think of as memory encircling? Because there is storage, there's the encoding, and then there's the retrieval. Mm-hmm. Is all of that memory? Like what? But you just said storage is memory. So how do we think about memory?
Well, I mean, okay, maybe memory is just a not very useful term anymore. Maybe it's just too maybe it has too many subparts. So you're right. I mean, I just informally mean it's the stored information that can be written in and written out. So there's an encoding that has to happen, a long-term storage that has to happen, and a retrieval so they can plug these things in. Right, that's the cool thing. Whether you're talking about low-level things or high-level things, let's talk about the ant navigation stuff. Those are small brains, and it's not trivial. You pull out some value, you have a counter or an odometer, and you say, well, I have to put this value into this equation that I get out this vector. I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, that's pretty amazing. But it's very specialized, and so you don't need huge, integrated information theory or, global workspace theories of consciousness to solve that. You need a circuit that does that. But the question is, are we, in our enthusiasm of just focusing on description of implementation, have we lost track of the problem that's actually trying to be, that's under the microscope that we're trying to solve? And so we're so excited about every technical advance at the level of, single cell, transcriptomics. Cool. It's amazing that you can do it. And it's a wonderful description, but it's not, is it going to yield explanation? And that's where I'm not so enthusiastic. And I think we're being misled.
So you're not a fan of the Ngram? The modern story of the Ngram.
Why would I not be?
Well, when I think of Ngram, what I kind of think of, so I had Thomas Ryan on, and I think of that kind of work, Tonegawa, et cetera, where it's basically like these cells kind of get labeled, right? And then you have a pattern of cells, and that pattern is the physical trace, and so they get tagged essentially, and the tagging of the cells is another issue to talk about. But I think of it in terms of the cell level and like a pattern of cells, not the internal intranuclear storage mechanism.
Yeah, no, but I think that's a debate between Ryan has done wonderful experiments on this. I think he's. The question is, what's the physical basis of memory? And their notion of Ngram is just a different notion of Ngram than someone like Glanzman or Gallistel, right? So I think they're working on
the physical trace of memory. That's what the Ngram means, and but however
the physical. So there's a nice paper. I think it's in Cognition by Gallistel called "The Physical Basis of Memory," where he lays out the arguments why it's so difficult to do it in a synaptic way. So I think we're all. I mean, maybe we're using terminology in a too sloppy way still because we have this sort of historical baggage. But and maybe the message for me is it's really critical to be a splitter and not a lumper. It's like you said, like what is memory? Well, maybe let's be more principled and careful and be like, wow, it has all these parts. Which ones are the ones where maybe the encoding part at some stage? That's not a one size fits all thing. That has lots of complicated steps. Maybe some of them are more obvious and some of them are totally non-obvious. They're not problems, they're mysteries. So maybe that's one of the things we can do is just to be much more careful, pedantic splitters. Splitting pedantry as a virtue.
Splitting pedantry. I mean, maybe we'll get into this in a little bit, but you've recently done some work with large language models, and the paper suggests or argues that, well, we should use more of what we know about human memory and basically try to build large language models with augmented memory, which is there's a lot of that work already being done. But your work says, well, there are these subroutine processes that we know have to occur for encoding and storage and retrieval. So maybe we should use those to inspire large language models.
Mhm.
And you guys have done a little bit of that work. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. That seems to me just like much of science, where be, let's say, pragmatically opportunist. I mean, stuff is hard, and so look to where you can to get little tweaks and whatever, a good pair of scissors and a screwdriver to put the thing together to help you understand stuff. I think it's really. I mean, isn't that what we always do? We look around and we're like, oh, that actually could be really useful to solve this problem over here. So this requires pliers. So, oh, look, there's a pair of pliers. The kind of I think pragmatic opportunism is it has to be the partner to principled theorism. I mean, I like the sort of theoretically inspired research, but in our day-to-day lab work, we would be crazy not to use the techniques we have available. So, I mean, one of the things I've worked on, I've worked on, one of my postdocs has worked on for a long time now, a postdoc named Yue Sun. He's a postdoc at AZ in Frankfurt on using, computational approaches, and sometimes just counting and carefully construct a thing to ask the question, what is the parts? What is the parts list? We're trying to keep. We're like mechanics. That's how I see ourselves. Like what is one of the parts? And he's just a question, as you'd think, very banal question about what's a syllable? Turns out to be extremely difficult theoretically, computationally, and we just had a paper come out a week ago or so where that's many years of work of Yue carefully constructing the argument that it's a primitive. It's one of the basic Lego blocks of the language system. Now you'd think that would have been settled 100 years ago, but it ain't so.
Right.
So it requires a lot of work and a lot of kind of at the intersection of theory and just basic computational stuff to figure out that that's a Lego block. But that's cool. That's good to know. Now we know, okay, so now we have these 3 Lego blocks or something like that. And maybe we can have some, other Lego blocks. But you have to be willing to look to all kinds of weird things to make these cases. I mean, maybe that's more like Paul Feyerabend's against method in terms of philosophy of science, right? So there's a little bit of chaos, and then there's these moments of insight that rejigger your conceptualization of the problems.
This is an aside, and I'm sorry for that, but how have you? So you strike me as someone who has always kept your head above the clouds and kind of trying to see the big picture, and you have a philosophical bent, and you always seem to have. But how do you stay in both worlds? At like the low level, you're the mechanic, but you're also the philosopher, right? And how has that affected your career? Do you think has it helped? Do you recommend that to everyone? Everyone has different personalities and does science differently, etc.
I don't recommend it, but no, it's an interesting.
I can see you can kind of get sucked down into the inability to move forward if you see all of the problems, right?
Yeah, you got it. I mean, you get it. It can be so. But here, I mean, I've a couple of. So, as an advanced middle age, privileged professor, let me say one. As most of us know, a good thing to do, although I don't know if it's good in the sense of history of science and philosophy of science. A good thing to do is pick a problem and beat it down. So there's nothing wrong with working on your favorite subtype of the NMDA receptor for 20 years. Absolutely nothing wrong. Something important will be built that becomes sort of the test bed for further experimentation and theorizing. And so focusing on something that's making the problem well-defined and sharpening it and really sticking, I think it's very good. But then if you have intellectual ADHD, like I do, it's very difficult to sit still because you are not, I feel like I'm not even close to what I'm actually trying to figure out. So for me, this metaphor, well, it's not a metaphor. I mean, the notion of a parts list is very important. I mean, it's how I think about stuff. Or the notion of primitives in cognitive science, or if you're more philosophically inclined, the ontological structure of the domain. And it's important to me because I understand the nature of I simply understand, I get it. I could say, look, there's a bunch of parts. And it's a little more straightforward in the case of the implementation level of description. You can say, look, there's cells, but these cells have the following parts, and then there's an endoplasmatic reticulum, and there's this thing, and there's a protein there. And you can make a list. And making lists is in some sense very satisfying. It's also tricky because, as Feynman said, there's always room at the bottom. It's smaller and smaller and smaller. But you can have a clear sense of primitive or elementary pieces and elementary operations. That's something that we do, and it's very clear to understand when we look at the implementation of tissue in biology. Right? I think we can do the same thing in the psychological and cognitive sciences, or the computational cognitive science, or whatever. Who cares what we call it? That is, we subdivide the thing into what we think are the elementary constituents there. Hence my example of the syllable, like this. That's for me now one of the primitives. That's a Lego block. It's necessary for perception, for production, and for storage. I think that's a known. So, and as you were mentioning, I think of this in terms of kind of linking hypotheses. If I'm convinced that the list of items that we have at the implementation level is pretty well developed or well motivated, and likewise I have such a list of elementary representations, although that's a red flag for them, computations, then the problem becomes a little bit more clear to me. And it's simply, for me, I think about it this way at the level of sort of philosophical analysis of the problem, because I'm too dumb to think about it otherwise. I need like lists and arrows. That's how I can think about it very clearly, because I know it helps me define the problem. It helps me understand that, look, this is extremely difficult because we know this is done, and we know this is the substance, this is the stuff of brain, and this is the stuff of mind. How's this supposed to work? Here's a way to do it. Be a dualist. Very elegant, no problem. Our work is done. If you're not a dualist, then the shit has kind of hit the fan. And then we have to really go to great lengths to figure out even the most elementary things, such as storage or encoding, storage, and retrieval. That's one of the most elementary things that presumably nervous systems are for. And so if we don't have that right, then how are we going to make progress on anything else? So there always is a back and forth between nitty-gritty experimentation and then zooming out and trying to figure out, well, what is this about? What is this? Does this have an aboutness? And for me, there's been, because of my ADHD, I just like to read stuff about different things. And I found it interesting.
But you don't recommend it.
I do.
But you just said you don't recommend. You began with saying that you don't recommend your approach to aspiring scientists. I don't recommend
it to if you have a very straight. I mean, if you feel like you have to make steady progress.
Oh.
And that you feel on safe ground, I don't recommend it. Stay at the implementation level of description and work on a very particular thing. If you're already destabilized or neurotic, or you like a lot of things, then I recommend it for two reasons. First of all, access to extremely interesting ideas that are old and that we just forget at our own peril, and kind of new ways to think of an older. So let's take Plato. I mean, the notion of the dialogue Meno, right? Meno, is a pretty interesting discussion about how can you know something new. What is the notion of discovery? And when you read that kind of stuff, you're like, actually, that's not such a stupid. That may be 2,500 years old, but these people weren't idiots, right? So it's a kind of, you're like, well, I actually have to think about that, because it makes interesting arguments for, did you have to know it before? Does it have to be innate? How would you actually know it at all? How could you actually discover something new if you didn't know there was a hole? I mean, it raises sort of the logical inconsistencies with our notion of science and our notion of epistemology or knowledge accrual in a very interesting way. So it's worthwhile reading that stuff if you're inclined to think about that way. But the danger is that you then get, as you pointed out, you go down a bunch of rabbit holes. How can you reconnect it to experimental questions that you're trying to answer? That's the real challenge, and then sometimes it just goes wrong.
Well, this is
But
related to the
older
question.
papers, by the way, just another, just as a recommendation, which I tell people in my lab all the time, it's one of my biggest recommendations. Also, just read old stuff, not just because it's just because it was written better. Because the papers we write now are just excruciatingly boring, cookie cutter, formulaic schlock. They all look the same, they sound the same. But these older papers, even like read Journal of Neurophysiology papers from 50 years ago, they're just beautifully written, they're fun, they're interesting, they're quirky. You see someone like working out an idea, it'd have like 60 figures, and you're like, wow, that's real intellectual engagement with the problem. Our papers are like figure 2L.
Yeah.
You know?
Why has that changed?
I mean, it must be for the better somehow.
When you were mentioning earlier, I'm going to kind of switch gears here about the things that we know we need implementation level wise. And we were discussing this in terms of language. I don't think so. You need your sensory modalities to be connected with the storage, to be connected with the motor modalities. And what you didn't mention is that you have to do it quickly at the milliseconds level time frame. And you also didn't mention oscillations in that list. So I wanted to bring that up and time and oscillations and large language models and what you think of the large language models and what they can and can't tell us, or how have they affected your thinking about language, multiple realizability, implementation level, etc.
I mean, so at the moment, let's go out, outside in. So what is science about?
Wow.
And
there you are above the clouds again.
Well, I mean, there's a point, but let me,
Sure.
I'm just trying to sort of see if I can get to questions step by step. So I think one way to think about that is historically, but a kind of simple distinction is one way to do science, and what science is about is prediction and control.
I see.
Those are two very foundational things, and they play a huge role in science and also in engineering. A different way, and a complementary, not necessarily completely distinct, but a different way of thinking about it and a different way of practicing science is, let's say, explanation and understanding. And there are cases where these things come together very elegantly, and then there are cases where that doesn't work, at all. In the worth of Ruth Langmore from Ozark, we don't know shit about fuck.
That's a television show. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Very, very good. And so the current work on these on engineering of speech and language and using models of that form falls right into this difficult tension. So it's very clearly useful. Well, it's obvious. So let's first of all dispense with: is it useful? Yes, it's very useful. It can do cool things.
Yeah.
So it's not what this is about. Yes, it's cool that you can do all these things. Although one might have some ethical concerns, energy consumption concerns. There's lots of complicated debate that's worth having, actually.
Yeah.
But just on the science stuff, so it's the kind of work is more on the side of prediction and control. I mean, these are systems we build in order, and obviously the notion of prediction is at the very center of this, sort of
right,
predicting the next thing, and control in the sense of engineering theory. And I think, and we can use that, we can capitalize on models like that to analyze our data, to think about what we can learn, and so on. The question is, does it meet what we think of in the sciences when we're trying to do understanding and explanation? There, I'm not so optimistic at the moment. I think that they're super cool, and they're also super far away from what it is that we've accomplished so far in 100 years of psychology and cognitive science.
Oh.
So I'm certainly, I think it's a very interesting test bed for looking at things and for developing ideas. I do not at the moment think they have any particularly good relation to our criteria of explanation and understanding of a domain as complicated as language. So now let's take these big models. Can we suppose we start adding interesting stuff to them? Is that so? Let's call it biologically inspired AI or something like that. That's interesting. That's an interesting question. I mean, is that going to actually open new ways of thinking about what the models do, how we think about hypothesis formation, and what we think of a theory is supposed to account for, and so on. So there, I think it's early days. But for the moment, I very much appreciate the engineering contribution and how we can use models like that for example, data analysis or labeling.
Yeah.
Very cool, very useful, actually, super. Totally different questions if we're standing around and saying, like, how is this actually going to answer a particular question about, let's say, storage? I have no idea. I don't even know if it's askable. So I'm both optimistic about one aspect of it, and I'm sort of like meh about the other aspects, and remains to be seen. I mean, in part that has to do again with that models of the form are high at the level of they load on the level of implementation, and not so much on the level of sort of computational theory or explanation. I think that divide is a very profound one.
But even the storage question, I mean, you could say that there's an argument to be said that, well, the answer is, I mean, obviously they don't have nuclei. They're not storing things internal to the units, et cetera. So they are stored at the connection weights in some sense.
Yeah.
I don't, and pretty long dependencies as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, if we assume that there are sort of analogies, then the analogy would be to kind of empiricist models of behaviorist, empiricist, associationist models of storage and computation. So in terms of the way these things are conceptualized, built, and then talked about, they're much more aligned with the notion of synaptic type of, I mean, that's what they build on, right? The notion of, oh, well, there's weights all over the place. So they align well with that. And there's the challenges a la Glanzman, a la Gallistel, a la Johansson, a la Peter Balsamson is simply, I think it's just simply not arrived there. But I think that, so let's take the challenge of oscillation. So suppose you build a model. So I mean, I have two colleagues, and in fact, the very distinguished visual neuroscientist Wolf Singer, who's a member of my institute in Germany, and his team, most notably Felix Effenberger, a postdoc in that lab, have worked with building large models in which they explicitly use the notion of a damped harmonic oscillator as being a key of every unit. And then they're sort of saying, like, look, that's our notion of what certain layers of cortex simply have as part of their infrastructure. They say, look, super granular layers, whatever, here, layer 2 has, and let's just conceptualize this as every unit or every node being a damped harmonic oscillator. Pretty interesting results. I mean, I don't think I believe the paper is not out yet, but they've built this, and they've really tried to sort of analyze sort of a range of kind of canonical tasks and new things, and we're collaborating with them now to test it on, for example, perception things. And it just is so that's a way to go. That would be, let's call it, it's not really biophysics. It's not a biophysical model, but it's sort of biologically inspired in the sense that let's take a feature of cortex and see what does it add. I mean, does it actually, it's sort of a hypothesis generation model. It says, if this works, that's cool. Let's see if we can now turn that around and experiment. So I think there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained. So there is, even in the case of something as contentious as oscillations, there can be, I don't actually know why it's so contentious. I mean, I think it's just people get really exercised about it. Those are things that are physiological excitability cycles. People have shown it for a long time. Sometimes they seem clearly to have causal force, sometimes not. Nobody gives a single, one size answer for all of this. People are nuanced. They know it's complicated. They know you have to be very, very careful about your. I mean, it's just it's sort of become a self-sustained debate about there's controversy but no issue.
Yeah. Well, this just goes back to the difficulty in thinking across levels and about circular causality, right? Because you need to explain things at one level. That's what we're comfortable with. And as soon as you start going across levels, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah. Because we don't have good linking hypotheses. That's
you go.
That's the special sauce.
Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, that's another thing that Jeff Shaw. When I was a postdoc in his lab, every year we read a handful of papers, and David Teller's linking hypotheses is one of those papers. So you have kindred spirits out there still.
Yeah, no. I think it's look, I don't know if you've had. I'm not sure if you've had on your podcasts, Catherine Carr from the University of Maryland, College Park.
No.
Catherine is an absolutely, brilliant neuroethologist who's done really foundational work. And for example, some of her work that she did jointly with Konishi on barn owl, on the barn owl sound localization, it's the kind of work that I aspire to for the speech or language case, or any aspect of cognition for that matter, because they have really worked out the nuts and bolts from the cellular, subcellular level to what kind of math is being done, to what kind of behavioral task that can be made explicit and quantified is being solved. And it's one of the most beautiful pieces of biology. I think it's totally underappreciated because that is one of those linking things, one of the very few examples I know where the across-level analysis is totally successful. You should really speak to Catherine. She also has a very evolutionary take. As a neuroethologist, unsurprisingly, she thinks very evolutionary. Really beautiful. And someone who also does work like that, that's really, is Gilles Laurent, right? With this work on, for example, sleep in lizards, or that's, I think, very elegant. So trying really to go from cells and circuits to very interesting and complicated behavior. So I think one of the things that's coming back that I'm very excited about is ethology and neuroethology. And we've talked about this before. The value of being, again, principled pedantry and being extremely careful about the behavioral analysis. That doesn't mean you have to have everything in a naturalistic context. I mean, that's almost impossible to do. But to be careful about, is the behavior that you're studying for an organism matched to the kind of question you're asking? Or is it just like, we do this because we actually have done this experiment for 25 years and it kind of works? I'm like, yeah, whatever. Nice. Good on you. But I think bringing back the sort of ethological thinking is super, super helpful for where we are, including for the artificial neural network thinking. It's very, very good. And it brings us away from this kind of the implementation. What do I want to call it? The imperialism of thinking like an implementationalist. Like this is the disagreement I have with Yuri Buzhaki. I mean, Yuri thinks very strongly what he calls inside out: characterize, measure very carefully, and then the story will tell itself of what is the actual functional analysis of the problem. And I say, I think that's ass backwards. And I respect and love Yuri, but I think it's wrong. I think it's actually, you have to have, and that's what we call the implementation sandwich. There's actually a secret theory underlying this stuff before you make your measurements. It's just latent. The implementation is actually sandwiched between latent theory and then actual explanation of what you're trying to do. So you have to have, and what neuroethology brings to us, what's so exciting about it is it says, let's try to really understand what this critter is doing. Let's observe, let's measure, let's think about it. What is this? What's actually trying to be solved here? I mean, it's interesting that this cuttlefish is trying to become like its background. Well, what's up with that? Like, how's that possible? And so to think again, much more to not immediately make the jump. This is not to say we're not supposed to do neuroscience. We're supposed to do neuroscience. We're neuroscientists, even if we're, like in my case, a self-hating neuroscientist. But let's not immediately jump to the level of measurement, and more data collection. And let's see, well, can we characterize what is precisely the problem we're trying to study behaviorally, computationally, whatever domain you're in, before making the leap to let's just measure everything like maniacs, just because we can, because the tools are cool. Yes, we can opt to. Let's go ahead and have, well, it's nuts what we can do. It's amazing the stuff we can do now at the level of the tissue. It's fantastic. But it hasn't. Has it? Can you point to a case where you say, well, that nailed it. That solved that problem in cognition or motor. I don't. I think that actually our edifice of knowledge, the body of knowledge we built, is probably more solidly built on behavioral and psychophysical data, and actually deficit lesion data from long gone. Careful, deep study of individual cases that had, where you can very precisely characterize the. Now, of course, the granularity of analysis of the neurobiology is very coarse, but the functional specification has been very impressive. You read those papers from the 60s and 70s, they were beautifully done, very elegant deficit lesion work that says, oh my goodness, who knew that actually dissociates so crisply? Right. That tells you something, right?
Are you talking about humans, though? I mean, I know you're talking about animals, yeah. but I was going to ask you about.
Well, it's more compelling. I think that what captures the imagination of the human cases.
Yeah,
but it was done, of course, in animal models. Take the original multiple pathway stuff. I spent much of my career on this kind of dual stream model of perception. That didn't come out of nowhere. That came through originally, the kind of big picture thing became associated with Mishkin and Ungerleider. Mm-hmm. And a lot of Leslie Ungerleider's work when she was early on in Mort Mishkin's lab at the NIH. But there were earlier works on this notion of parallel pathways, solving different kinds of problems in the visual system, was already shown by Jerry Schneider in the 60s in rodents, and showing distinctions between, let's say, the tectum and cortical contributions and so on. The notion that you actually subdivide the problem into computational subroutines that solve particular things. That was a long story, and was shown. I think the first papers I'm aware of were Jerry Schneider's papers from, I want to say, the 60s. Then Ungerleider and Mishkin really made it a big thing. And then people like us we just adopted it and adapted it. We say, well, that's a clever idea because it shows you actually how anatomic subdivisions can actually help you solve certain sub-problems. And Greg Hickok and I basically just built on that and said, hey, suppose that works the same way. That would actually solve a lot of our problems. And where did that come from? It came from lesions. The original idea came from lesions in animals that Schneider did with rodents. Ungerleider and Mishkin then did it with primates. And then people like Goodale and Milner showed it in lesions in humans. And so that's one of the examples of where kind of ethologically inspired animal work goes from rodent to primate to human to computation to higher order cognition, and showing that the divide and conquer strategy is a kind of ubiquitous phenomenon that serves. That doesn't mean we understand it fully, but there's no disagreement that something of that form is the right theory. Now, people, there's all kinds of different versions of this. I unsurprisingly like our own, but that doesn't make it right. It just means, but basically, there's consensus that is one way that nervous systems solve these complicated problems. And so that's lesion behavior. It's all of that stuff together, and and again, people want a quick answer, like, will large language models get this? This took like 50 years to get to this rather banal insight. Like, it's just slow. Stuff is slow.
Yeah, but doesn't it feel so fast right now with the development of the bigger models? Things are moving faster, aren't they?
Things feel like they're moving fast. It's not obvious that insight is moving fast. The work is moving fast, and the fact that it feels a little bit like science is being. I've talked about. I've actually thought about writing about this. Is science has become replaced by engineering, or basically, at least in my area, cognitive neuroscience, say science is basically regression. Science is now correlation and regression, and that's engineering. And so everything moves very fast if that's sufficient. If you're like we talked about earlier, if the notion that you're trying to capture is prediction and control, that's nice. I don't know about control so much, but that's good. If your notion is explanation and understanding, it's not moving that fast. I mean, what is it that you want?
Yeah, well, that's the thing is I'm constantly coming back, and so I'm self-hating in this regard, I suppose. So we're in the same boat there. What is the real value? Because I want explanation and understanding, but then it's really prediction and control that moves the world forward. And it's just a selfish sort of desire for me to understand things, but I'm not sure what the gain is, except for personal satisfaction. And I don't feel, I'm not sure. I often come back to the notion that I don't matter in this world. So what does it matter if I have an explanation / understanding? How does that really help? But then mostly I live in the world of like, that's actually what I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question for you and your therapist. I mean,
oh yeah, I should go to therapy.
Because
that's what you are. You're my therapist today.
So, I mean, I think you're right in the sense that we have a very kind of instrumentalized view of this. We want progress of a certain form that makes us feel like something has happened, that we're moving forwards, but I think there are lots of cases where that's just not, I don't think that certainly these things are mutually exclusive. Like the more understanding and real explanation you have, it doesn't cross-cut the value of prediction and control. Right? I think but take something like celestial mechanics. I mean, we have pretty good understanding and explanation of why things move the way they do at this point. We can't control any of it, but we can predict it. I mean, so like, where do you really care? It sounds more like you care about control. And control, I would recommend engineering or the medical sciences, where you can develop, a vaccine, a pill, a cure, a procedure. But that is not necessarily completely aligned with the sciences. So look, one thing that's really, just to say, in terms of sociology of science, one thing that Germany has got right, and other countries as well, but I mean Germany, because I work there, I have more intuitions about it. Like the notion of having something like a Max Planck Society is an amazing luxury of, for humanity, in the sense that there's funding, public funding, to pursue pure basic research, no questions asked. I mean, as an actual common good, as a good for society. So there are other parts in Germany, by the way, that are much more applied. There are the Fraunhofer Society and the Leibniz Institute. And those are really they're more like NIH. The task is do something very specific. We want to see an output of this. But the notion that there is something like a Max Planck Society, where the people, and there's 25,000 people work there, that you are actually encouraged and funded to just follow your hunch, because we just don't know. And probably, 19 times out of 20, it's just some rabbit hole. But there's then every now and then a profound insight from basic research that's game changing. And the fact that we value that's something, I think that probably existed more maybe after World War II in the United States. I mean, in the sort of, Vannevar Bush or whatever, but why? I think that's actually pretty amazing that a country says we're willing to spend public funding on people where I don't know whether there's going to be a pill, a product, a program. We just don't know. I mean, it could be, and I could be wrong. I mean, this is one of the things that convinced me to take a position there, that because I assume we're wrong. I take that for granted. That 10 years, people are going to look at that and be like, well, that was cute or dumbass. So
Instead of that
the
really nailed it.
yeah, instead of that nailed it. Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
so isn't that an amazing thing? But and that's that is that there are countries who say, look, go to it. I don't know. I don't demand that at the end of your 5-year funding, there is a clear step towards a pill or something like that, or a new hearing aid.
But in the long run, that's the proof is in the pudding, right? Because it's still the bet is that will produce progress in some form, in some as to now unknown way.
In an unknown way that likely won't affect us. So that it's a form of sort of intellectual altruism into the distant future.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So it's distant future. So it's really a long bet.
It's a long bet. And I think you're right. I mean, I share that intuition that, the assumption is, I'm not allowed to say that because I do work for Max Planck. I'm supposed to be defending basic science here. But you're right. And I absolutely have the intuition that in the long bet is, in fact, something will come out of it that has concrete consequences. But I mean, I don't have, how will we know until after the fact? I mean, we sit in these things, right? So you go to the NSF or the NIH, and one of the criteria for your grant is the work transformative?
Yeah.
Well, that's nice. How would you know that until much, much, much later?
Right.
So do you honestly think without a deep sense of irony, I can write that paragraph into my grant without like laughing at myself? And I mean, this is a ridiculous. And I've said that in study sections and in meetings and as a member of the advisory board, I was like, can we please stop being just save that paragraph to add more interesting stuff about the ideas or don't give me the kind of bullshit paragraph. Like this, we can save that for leave that to let's just do our stuff and be explicit about what we do. Be very clear. For example, be very, very good about how stuff can be replicated. That is in fact useful. Can someone else do it? Make some minor variants and get basically the same stuff. It's super, super important because then it allows us to build on that body of inquiry. But forget the kind of game-changing, I am in my grant, and when I'm done, that's really going to help stroke.
Schizophrenia. It's always about
schizophrenia, depression, mild cognitive impairment. I'm like, yeah. Okay, right on.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the shockers of the last, of science is that we are grotesque under failure to understand mental illness. I mean, it's a debacle. I mean, after 50 years or 100 years of it's just shocking how bad we're doing there.
Well, okay, so this is what I was going to ask about, with the neuroethological approaches you were talking about, and how far we can take that with humans, because we have our own cognitive ontology of what humans are doing, and maybe this will lend itself to thinking about these high cognitive dysfunctions, right? Disorders. And, does that neuroethological approach, can we even use it, apply it to humans? How far can we take it with humans when we're the things that we're trying to understand? And so we have to define what we're trying to understand. If you want to be a Marian, we have to come with a computational previous cognitive ontology and talk about what the function is and the computational goal is. But are we, even good at that? I know this is, we kind of talk about this ad nauseum sometimes on the podcast, but you mentioning the disorders made me bring that back in. Just curious, whether we really can.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things to say. Like, I mean, one is unsurprisingly, we have epistemic bounds.
Right.
I mean, we are parochial. We have a brain that is the way it is. Like certain things we can see, other things we can't see because that's our receptor structure, and that's the same going to be for cognition. Certain things we can cognize, other things will be outside of our epistemic bounds for reasons of our architecture. But that's that. Okay, but we're not going to get that can bum us out in a big picture. But I mean, we're not going to stop by that. I mean, we can still ask questions as carefully as possible. And so, what would be the neuroethological approach? Is this kind of tension between naturalistic experimentation, whatever that is, or just kind of characterization in the wild, and controlled work. And I think, both have extremely high value. Let me give you an example of both, just in my own line of work. So an example of really, let's say, psychophysical pedantry taken to the extreme is a series of papers by my student and now postdoc Matthias Grabenhorst and Yorgos Michalareas on one particular question of a computation. And that is, so one of the things about prediction that's kind of ubiquitous in the prediction literature, and especially in the temporal structure of perceptual experience, is the so-called reaction times and hazard rate. So as you think something is likely to happen, your reaction gets faster and faster, right? So if you like you're standing at the traffic light, it's not green, and then you step. So this is a long literature from over 100 years. And people think about the temporal structure of your experience because it's so compelling. We all feel it all the time. So there's a famous theory. It's been around for a long time, and it's been actually most prominently worked on by Mike Shadlin and other people in that field. And Mike Shadlin in the monkey case, but others in the human case, which is the so-called hazard rate. Mm-hmm. Right? So the hazard rate is basically a function that says, well, as the thing gets more and more likely to happen, I get faster and faster, and you can see certain cells. Now, Matthias Grabenhorst and Yorgos Michalareas had worked for years in very, very hardcore, super reductivist experiments in the lab to test what is really the function that you're building. And the answer in a series of papers from a lab is actually what you're doing is just you're able to extract the PDF, the probability density function of the event structure. You don't actually need all the extra steps to get to the hazard rate. To calculate the hazard rate, you have to invert the function, you have to calculate the CDF and so on. There's a bunch of steps, all of which are a little labile. So through very, very careful psychophysical reductive experimentation, you're sitting in a booth and you're doing the same super boring, non-naturalistic experiment. You can, however, extract something very kind of fundamental, which is the calculation and extraction of a PDF is one of the building blocks. So just like I said earlier, for me, in the language case, the syllable is a building block. For me, in the temporal structure perception world, extracting a PDF is a building
inferring
block. I believe in that now. We've done experiments.
You have to infer it from incomplete knowledge, you're saying. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So those are kind of, so that's an example of using very lab-centered, non-naturalistic, non-ethological experiments. But there, the hypothesis is super clear. It's computationally super explicit. It's this function or that function. And then you do very precise experiments to adjudicate, and you fit a bunch of models, and you say, like, look, this is what it turns out to be. It's actually easier. It's easier to extract the PDF than a hazard rate. I think it fits the data better. It works for hearing, touch, and seeing, and so on and so forth. So we can make a contribution by saying our new hypothesis is the fundamental computational building block isn't function X, it's function Y. So that's useful. On the other hand, could you do that? So I think that you can make good contributions with these super reductivist lab-based non-ethological. On the other hand, so take the language case. They're increasing experiments, and you were alluding to this, where you listen to naturalistic stuff and you use large language models to sort of get at the nitty-gritty. And there, you can actually make pretty nice. So one of a paper I'm very happy with that I think is very cool was a part of the dissertation of Laura Williams. And she was a graduate student at NYU. She's now just started as a faculty member at Stanford. She's an extremely accomplished neurolinguistics scholar. She did in one of her thesis experiments with naturalistic narratives. Right? So you're doing nothing. You're listening. You're sitting there in the scanner. You're listening to a bunch of stories. But she had a very particular theoretically motivated questions. What are you actually tracking, and how much of it at any given moment? And so one of the very interesting and beautiful data she found really that's best seen in naturalistic ecological experimentation is as you go through the stream of speech, um, of course, there's phoneme by phoneme by phoneme, by syllable by syllable. But let's take the phoneme level, the single speech sounds. How many at a time do you have access to? So she was able to show some very beautiful decoding experiments on neurophysiological data that at any given moment, you can actually grab onto 3. You can successfully, at any time point that you sample, hear, as it were, or grab onto for perceptual experience 3 phonemes as you go through. At the same time, if you can keep them separate. That is, they have a separate sort of representational identity. You don't have confusions. It's not that the 3 become a kind of gemisch of messy, unseparable things. They're actually separable. And so that only works if you have a completely naturalistic case where you don't actually give people individual sounds or individual words. You have to have the stream happen. So you can make a contribution to our understanding of just spoken language recognition by doing a neuroethologically motivated experiment. So I think there's, again, you got to pick your weapon for the question. What's the question that you're trying to answer? And then, so even in the human case, ecologically valid experimentation, and people are trying to have it now walking around and having EEG headsets on and having conversation. I think that's very ambitious and bold. I think sometimes it's a little bit cheesy, but
more data collecting.
If the question is well defined, it might work. It might work.
But it is a lot more data collecting for perhaps
that
unprincipled reasons sometimes.
That's the downside. There can be a lot of just for it's unprincipled, and often, unless it's theoretically very well developed, it's a lot of data mining without a question, and that is of course something that there I get pretty unhappy or ungenerous as a colleague or reviewer.
Curmudgeonly, one could say.
Curmudgeonly, yeah.
So, David, it's a Sunday. I know that you take this most of your day to reflect on the benevolent Christian God. I have to go. I have to go hang out with my benevolent family. But so I don't want to keep you much longer. But anything else on your mind that you want to get off your chest? Anything else bothering you? I just wanted to have you on to kind of shoot the shit about your thoughts on the memory thing, and then get an update from you.
Yeah, no, I think that the look. I mean, again, if there's any theme coming out here it's that the memory story is so foundational to no matter what aspect you're in neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. We have to get a grip on it one way or the other. Whichever team you're on here, and I think you're doing. It's an important service that you're doing to the field in the sense that you got to have many people who are reflecting on something, because we have to sort it out. We're just kind of stuck. I mean, this is why I wrote this paper about We never talked about language of thought, which is a completely different kind of story.
Oh yeah. Oh, we do need to talk about that. But yeah.
But that's language of thought is an interesting philosophical idea, which I think is actually correct.
Let's talk about that, because I did want to talk about that because it's a huge topic, and so you've written this piece talking about how you think it's correct and some of the reasons why you think it's correct, but within the article, you talk about how it kind of disappeared for a while. And is that true? Was the language of thought prevalent and then discarded, and now it's reappearing? Is that a correct story?
I mean, yeah, a little bit. I mean, so the language of thought was very prominent in sort of Middle Age philosophy, and the idea was, well, you have to, we didn't. Well, how do you think? How does it actually work at all? And what format do you think in? And then there were in the philosophical literature, most notably by the philosopher Jerry Fodor, he sort of reignited that notion in, I guess, 60s and 70s, saying like, look, if this is a thing, if we're trying to figure out, I mean, he was really wearing his more cognitive science hat, less his philosophy hat. If there is such a thing of, we're able to think, it's very unlikely to be, it has to be a pretty abstract format. And let's just call it unfortunately, he used the expression language of thought, which made everyone think, oh, he means language, which is precisely what he didn't mean. That's a kind of bummer of a misnomer. He means, formal system of thinking. And he was trying to, develop a computational theory, say like, look, for the kinds of things we do, you need stuff like variables, functions, And so we just something like predicate logic or something like that. Very not a very bold claim, but it has things like variables. It is very abstract. It means you insert values into functions and so on. And but it was a very interesting idea, and it also said that look, there's aspects of thought that are separate from language, or separate from other domains, or separate from just let's say mental imagery, stuff like that. And it's a pretty interesting idea. And then that idea became pretty unpopular it wasn't really addressed at all. But then the neuroscience world basically said, look, it's horse shit.
Why is that?
It can't be implemented. It's the kind of stuff that simply we don't, it's so far away from, our notion of sensory systems or neural computation. It just doesn't, such a thing can't really be. It's a silly idea. But in the last few years, people have been sort of thinking about it again, thinking like, actually, we're trying to get our head around the relationship between thinking, language, other forms of representation. And so Nina Kazanian and I, our motivation was very straightforward. We think it's a very, whether it's right or wrong, it's a very interesting hypothesis. And we simply, as we wrote in the paper, we just disagree with the argument that it can't be done. And the way we construct that argument is super straightforward. We say, here, what were the requirements for a language of thought? And then this is what you would have to have. Okay, guess what? Here's an example. Here's a bunch of hippocampal cell types that do exactly what you think can't be done. They meet all the criteria. So there's, filler role independence, abstraction, scaling, and so on. So it's simply false to assert that it can't be done. Neural systems already have precisely that kind of architecture. It doesn't, and we don't argue that thought is spatial or it's all hippocampal. That's not. We simply wanted to provide examples. Say, look, here's a couple of cell types. They're extremely well evidenced, well known. There's a fact of the matter. They embody precisely the things functionally that are ostensibly not possible. Therefore, it's a bad argument. And the language of thought is, in fact, absolutely neurally possible. Our job is to figure out, is it, how do you do it? Where is it done? And so on and so forth. But I think there's a growing interest in, how this thinking, can we begin to get a thinking which is kind of internal, and it's in part separate from language, right? There are aspects that are just ineffable. They can't be externalized through language because language and thought are dissociable. And so so that's a fun and interesting way to think about it. So our demonstration is a very short and easy paper that simply says, hey, the entire entorhinal and hippocampal system is full of exactly the cells that's doing it. So go back and try again. Different argument, please.
But your argument is not, you're not pointing to just a list of all the different cell types, boundary cells, boundary vector cells, object cells, et cetera. You're not pointing at those and saying, these cells are doing language of thought. You're just using it as a reflection and saying, look, this is exactly language of thought. A language of thought type or like or allowed process is being reflected in the activity of these neurons.
That's exactly right. No, it's exactly as you're saying. Yeah, this is simply, one can then have different debates. And some people say, look, we think a lot of thinking is in fact spatial and so on, but that's not the point. Our argument is precisely as you summarized it. We're showing on principle, here's the type of operation that cells have to do. Here's an example of them. Best wishes.
Well, you're not. So where are you with that? Are you continuing that, or was it really just, hey, everybody, look, and then you're moving on?
Well, no. Of course, we. So Nina Kazanina, who's now going to be a professor. She's in Bristol. She's not going to be a professor in Geneva. Is going to continue that. I'm going to continue it, but that's for young people. That's young person's game. It's very difficult to. But it's a case where there are well-developed theoretical and computationally explicit ideas about what about, let's say, predicate calculus or something like that. And there's nothing, for anyone who studies vision or navigation, this is not a surprise. You have to do mathy type stuff.
Yeah.
This is not surprising. Why this is considered so outrageous baffles me, since to even get, from here to wherever you're going with your family requires all those things. This is not like, I don't get it. I just don't get why this is so objectionable, frankly.
When you reference a few different kind of review papers that touch on language of thought as well, that I guess they're all arguing that, hey, we do need to, section 1 starts, the reemergence of the language of thought. This is from Mandelbaum et al. And there are a couple of reviews that you point to.
That's right. Yeah, there's a reason. I mean, basically, in the last couple of years, there's been really kind of acknowledgement that this has been that it's a very important hypothesis about how the cognitive apparatus is organized, and we've sort of now blown. And it's time to kind of rethink very carefully what's going on. And so, yeah, Quilty, Dunn, Mandelbaum, Kazan, and others are saying like, hey, there's actually a game in town, certainly for cognitive science, psychology, philosophy, and let's actually see if it has very clear and good and testable implications for brain science. And I think I'm totally on board with that and excited to see it kind of come back, because again, just because people wrote it 800 years ago doesn't mean it was idiotic. It was people who thought very carefully about thinking. They didn't have the apparatus we have, but they said there's something, something smells funny. We have to figure out how we do this.
How do you think
they only had the computational theory of mind? They had nothing else, no imaging, no optogenetics, no single cell transcriptomics, just thinking cap.
Yeah. But what about, how do you think of this in terms of the recent popularity of the dynamics and attractors and state spaces? How do you think of that and with regard to or compared to something like the symbolic operations needed for a language of thought to occur?
Do we need, I don't quite understand why these should be mutually exclusive. I mean, they might be approaches that solve different kinds of sub-problems or different problems in general. I mean, I think that the dynamic stuff is super interesting. I mean, and important to pursue. But I don't see a principled conflict to having that kind of machinery and having symbolic computation implemented. And I just don't see why that should be a non-starter for both. That doesn't. I mean. Like, look, look how weird stuff is in the brainstem. I mean, totally closed configuration little nuclei that do like very, people don't, do we argue about that? No, I really motivate you, invite you to consider inviting someone like Catherine Carr.
Sorry, she's in my notes right now.
From her work on evolution and neuroethology, because you just see a kind of generosity of spirit and biological principledness that shows you how you can actually link levels and not worry about, like, maybe this is a dynamics kind of explanation over here, but we really need symbolic computation to solve this equation. And there's not, brain's a complicated place, right? So I don't see that they rule each other out, and they might not be solving the same kind of stuff. And both seem extremely important and interesting to pursue, actually.
Okay, David. Well, I appreciate your generous spirit as always. Thanks for coming on. You kind of did it on a whim too. I got that email from you. You sent me that paper. And I thought I should just ask him come back on. So I appreciate you sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely. It's fun. It's fun to talk about what we do, and it's entertaining. Now you go play. I'm going to go to the beach.
All right.
I think I'm going to go to Rockaway Beach right now. So
okay, happy beaching. Good talking.
Bye, Ball.
I alone produce Brain Inspired. If you value this podcast, consider supporting it through Patreon to access full versions of all the episodes and to join our Discord community. Or if you want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, consider signing up for my online course, Neuro AI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. You're hearing music by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.